CMMS Radio talks about all things CMMS, computerized maintenance management software, focused on maintenance management. It's the people, the process, and the culture that make your CMMS journey a success. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. Today we're meeting with Nathan Wright. He is with Transformational Performance Solutions. That's TPS. If you do want to visit the website, it's tps-solutions.com. You can find him there. We're going to talk about that later. First, I want to tell you he develops authentic transformational leaders who create a clear vision and strategy to improve organizational efficiency. I like that kind of stuff. He spent years working in the manufacturing, mining, and heavy equipment industries. He understands leadership, maintenance, asset management, and he's here to chop it up about all that stuff, and we're going to mix in a little bit of CMMS. Nathan, welcome to CMMS Radio.
All right, Greg, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, we've been working on this, and I say that about all the episodes because it's hard to manage these schedules for everyone. You're running and gunning. You've done so much. So I want to have you take us back. You have been in this game for a long time. First, I want to thank you for your U.S. Navy military service. I'm always thankful for that. And I want to understand, if you don't mind, how that set the stage for your career in this wonderful world of maintenance, this industry. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I grew up fourth generation maintenance guy. So my maintenance career actually started when I was 8, and my dad used me as slave labor. But it really took off when I got out of high school, and I spent a couple of years dabbling in drunk and stupid at a local university. And then I joined the Navy and got into electrical maintenance, right? So my background started out in the electrical world as what the Navy calls a fire controlman, which is a weapon systems repair operations guy, right? Because on ships, you don't have the guys that repair it and the guys that operate it. You do it all. There's no differentiation between electrical or mechanical either. The weapon system has both parts. We repaired it all. So that's where I started out and learning, well, I guess, my trade other than what my father had taught me. And then that's actually, I was just talking about how it was the first CMMS I ever came across. Was we started out with paper. That was our CMMS. It wasn't computerized, but it was a maintenance management system. You had to press so hard on it. It was 6 copies, right? And one went into a different filing cabinet. And that's how we managed maintenance. It was all hard copy. Then they came out with what they called Snap 2, which is a military jargon for standing at attention. Is where that acronym came from. I don't know what it actually stood for in real life, but that's when it was the first Navy CMMS that they'd ever implemented. And it wasn't a full-time job for somebody. So my guys, the electronics folks, actually were sent off to school to become the administrators. And I became what we call a 3M coordinator, which was a maintenance coordinator on a ship.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I got into this biz. And then after I got out, of course, I've worked in a lot of different industries over 4 decades. So that's kind of in a nutshell how I got started.
Yeah, you mentioned the 3Ms, and I have a handful of friends, as a result of the podcast and being part of maintenance in some way, shape, or form myself. Brian Bieski, Corey Dickens, Howard Penrose. The list goes on and on and on. I can't shout out everyone, but when I talk to them, they've mentioned 3M. They talk about the different levels and types of exposures you get depending on what type of vessel you were on. We've talked about things like, what happens in dry dock. We've even talked about what happens when you can't resolve things. And they say things like, well, you find a fan room. So it's something that I think really sets the stage well for, making that transition into industry when you're no longer in the military, because you understand a systems approach. You also understand when that approach isn't working and how to get it back on track. And a lot of that comes through we're going to call them being in situations that you just have to keep moving forward and solve them. And not everybody in, the civilian world knows how to do that. They really don't. And that's one of the benefits. So I'm always kind of a fan of how adapting that into what you now do and what you've done over all these years makes such an impact. You have been an electronic technician, an electrician, a reliability engineer, and the list goes on from there. how critical are these types of real world experiences to how you view not only leadership, but how that contributes to developing cultures of excellence, or what we might call maintenance excellence?
Right. So I've worked my way through the chain of command over the years, if you, for lack of a better word. Once I got out, you know, the mine company that I started with didn't recognize my Navy time, my 12 years of hands-on experience. So they started me out as an apprentice.
Mm.
And I had to go through an electrical apprentice with them, and then ultimately add a year for an instrumentation apprenticeship. And then down the line, they decided to do away with both electricians and mechanics and call us multi-craft. So they stuck electrician journeyman and mechanic journeyman together and had us apprentice each other for 4 years. So that's how I've learned my trade over all that time frame. And in doing so, I mean, I joke because I have that fancy title in front of my name. It says Dr. Nathan Wright, right? So I have a PhD, and people say, oh my goodness, he's an academic. I got my PhD when I was 53 years old. I'd worked a whole lot of my life before I ever went back to school. I didn't even go back to college until 2005. So trying to understand and actually trying to make some hurdles, because some companies think you have to have a degree to be able to run maintenance, which is ridiculous, but that's a different copy. um, so yeah, I mean, I would say that all the education that I had was maybe 5% of what I use. 95% of it comes from all those years of experience and all the people who I'm going to give credit for teaching me to whatever you want to call me today. Right. I don't like the term consultant because that's got a nasty connotation, but um, what I do today is I try to help companies do better at whatever, mostly maintenance, because that's my background. I do work on the leadership end with some senior leadership teams, but it's mostly about driving reliability efforts in plants. And that all goes back to my Navy time. I mean, that's where it all started. That was the foundation.
Do you think so? I'm fascinated by what you were talking about when you went and got your doctoral degree, and how people could, infer quite inaccurately that you are just an academic. It doesn't mean you don't have the prowess and the insights to, focus on academia, or, it certainly makes it possible for you to teach, and you develop a lot of skills being in those environments as well. But I wonder how much better your experience was when you went into the doctoral program, as it relates to all of these experiences. It's almost like doing that later set you up for even more success, because now you could real time start applying things that were being taught, discussed, debated, and sessioned out through all these different learning sessions during the doctoral program. Is that kind of an accurate way to describe that?
That's absolutely accurate. I mean, I think that it made it. I mean, like I said, my first 2 years out of high school, I majored in drunk and stupid. I was on my daddy's nickel, had no desire to go to school.
Right.
Um, Afterwards, I paid for my doctorate, $155,000. I owe $2,000 still as we sit here today. I'm still paying it off. And when you're paying it for yourself, you have a whole different an aspect of what you're going to be doing, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
and I can remember having lots of discussion with my professors who only had academia in their background, and they were teaching theory, and I was countering with real world. And only once did it ever cause any type of a rift, right? And there's actually one instructor that it went to the dean to settle the discussion between us because he refused to acknowledge the real world in some homework assignments, for lack of a better word, that I'd done. Um, so I had to go to the dean and through an appeals process to actually achieve a decent grade, because he was not going to recognize the real world experience of running a business when he was teaching me the theory of how to run a business. I don't know a lot of people, this is going to date me, but there was an old TV show that, or a movie that Rodney Dangerfield did, where he went back to school with his son or something.
Yeah.
And
It's
he was
called
sitting
Back
there,
to School.
yeah, it's called Back to School. And he was at odds with one of the instructors for the exact same thing. And it was really, truly just like that movie. Is that me and the instructor were clashing in class, right? And I'm sitting in a class at 50 years old with 19, 18, 20-year-old kids, and they don't know what the heck I'm talking about. So we had a good time. And I hope that experience with the people in my classes actually help them because I've actually still keep contact with four of my classmates from some of these classes that I went in, the younger generation, and we're still working on a mentor-mentee relationship.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you just in my own personal experiences, like when I went to college was much later. Um, and I remember being in classroom settings, and when someone was in a class with me, I was like in my 30s, right? And if they had real world experience of some kind, but they're in that classroom, there would be a lot of us students that were like paying attention to what they were saying as an interaction with the professor or instructor, depending if it was JC or at university. And the conversations during breaks and after class, it really turned that corner and solidified the things we were learning, studying, and I think it's a great story. It's why I wanted to ask about it, because I kind of expected to hear that. So it's good stuff. Do you have any stories about tough situations that you've encountered in any of these experiences, and then how you moved forward? So as it relates to maybe maintenance or interacting with team members or even with leadership that might not get it or doesn't take the time to get it. Anything like that?
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I write books too. So in some of my books, I mentioned that only 4% of all senior leadership teams in the world does it have any representation with anybody with any true reliability or maintenance background. That's the facts. I mean, there's only 4% of all these wonderful companies have anybody that knows a darn thing about this stuff on their senior leadership team. They all think they do, but very few of them actually do. And the ones that do, you can actually see in their performance how much better they are than the others. Um, but for me, I run up against that all the time, especially now with what I do. Right, is I'll walk into situations where the folks at top think they understand what's going on the floor or reliability. And I'll use a wonderful example. I walked into a gold mine. I was hired by the COO of a company. They said, "Go find out why my gold mine's not making the money." They were reporting an OEE, which is the overall equipment efficiency, of 98% in their mill. I walked into their mill. They had three very large SAG mills and only one of them running. And I looked at the guy that was giving me the tour, the plant manager, the facility manager, general manager. I said, "How do you have 98% when you have those two mills that have obviously been down for quite some time?" And he said, "Well, we only need to have one running." And I said, "Does your COO know that?" And he didn't. He didn't realize that they were defining their OEE around one of their three mills running 98% of the time. And the way that's a gentle thing, right? You can't just walk up to a COO and say, "Guess what? You need to get out of your office more."
Yeah.
Um, and I could have this guy because he was my first general manager back when I got out of the Navy. That's how long I'd known this gentleman. So I could have walked in, and I maybe had walked in and said, "Look, you need to get out of your office because they're lying to you." But you have to bridge that when you're in the world I'm in. I can't upset the general manager at the plant because he won't want me back. But I got to
Mhm.
do my job that I was hired to do. So you got to figure out how to be the people person, if you want to call it that, right? I joke that if I walked up to my wife and I said, "Hey, dear, you're so ugly, all your face could stop a clock," I'd get punched. But if I walk up to her and say, "Hey, sweetheart, when I look at you, all time stand still," I'll get a kiss. So being able to say things in a light that doesn't trigger somebody's negative response has been the most successful way I've come across trying to handle difficult situations.
That's it. I, right here, right now, I'll admit I'm not good at that at all, and I'm really resistant to it sometimes. So that's why I wanted to hear something like that when I ask a question like that. Um, I mean, great story. Do you mind me asking? We've got a special guest in the background. Sorry about that.
I got a couple
um,
of those myself.
yeah, yeah. There's this thing lately I've been kind of wrestling with, and I think it's an ongoing thing. How do you define maintenance?
So people love to ask me the question about what's the difference between maintenance and reliability. An easy answer is maintenance is maintaining the piece of equipment, and reliability is about making the machine do what it's supposed to do consistently and reliably. So maintenance for me, I think those two words are actually coming together. I've seen the evolution over 4 decades where the maintenance teams are much more about reliability than they were when I was a young maintenance guy, right? We actually were not tasked to think. I mean, we would go out, do the PM, even though there were things that I could see standing around me. My boss didn't want to hear about it. He just wanted me to get the job done and get out. And now I think the expectation is, at least when I'm dealing with people, is that you should be proactively looking at what other things are going to bite you, not just, tunnel vision on what you've been assigned to go do. So I think that that's been the biggest change in the industry over the last 4 decades for me, is seeing that I said evolution may not be. I mean, I would like to think that my boss would have wanted me to speak up, even though he didn't necessarily promote it. Um, but more so now, you see the maintenance managers, or whatever title you give them, engineers or whatever they're giving them in different companies, are looking for the maintenance people to be reliability folks, if you would, right? Trying to get out in front of stuff. Sadly, is where we're trying to do more with less, right? So we're giving guys more technical equipment than ever before. We're giving them less training than ever before, and we're wanting them to do more than ever before, and that doesn't work. I mean, you can't do that. That's not what human beings excel at, right?
Right.
So you have to be able to be very specific on what your expectations are from your maintenance reliability teams, whatever term. When I took over companies, I always took the maintenance off of my department's name and made it my reliability department, because historically operations and maintenance have always been at odds. Maintenance is subservient to operations in a lot of senior leaders' mindsets. If I change the word to reliability, don't change anything else, just change the word from maintenance to reliability. I had a whole lot easier time with senior leadership on board when I just made that simple little change. And it sounds crazy, but it worked. It worked at Kraft Foods when I ran Kraft Foods, worked at Caterpillar. I mean, people know these names. They worked at Firestone. So just that change from the word maintenance, which for some reason has gotten the reputation that it had, to the word reliability, had changed upper leadership's at least view of what these guys were expected and gals were expected to do.
This is so good. So good, because recently I did a post, and it was very recently, like the last 2 days. And there's this idea that maintenance and reliability are two distinct things. And then for me, there's this idea that they're inextricably linked. And what you just said, having been there, having been, in the trenches, a bona fide expert practitioner, that is very, very helpful for the ongoing debate. And I'm not saying there's a right answer. There might be a wrong answer. I don't know. I'm not the guy to say that, but the way you explain that is really helpful for me, because I felt like that's more along the lines of how it at least currently is viewed. And sometimes someone might want to, get out a textbook or bring out, some parameters. Maybe it's regionally different, like in Europe or, other parts of the world. So that's one that we're going to table for now, but I'm looking to keep that as a kind of a hot topic. How, because I was going to ask how that's connected to or part of reliability, but you just made that really, really clear. What role does the CMMS play in, I'm going to change it up a little bit, in sustainable manufacturing?
Right. So the CMMS is a tool, just like a wrench in the world. The way I view things, right? I walk into places and I say, "What's your maintenance approach?" And they'll tell me SAP or Maximo or some one of the wonderful CMMSs, and I say, "That's not a maintenance approach. That's a maintenance tool." And I'm going to go back to what I started off with, writing down, pressing hard, 6 copies, and then putting in a different filing cabinet. And then trying to go back, and I never went back to look for history because it was impossible to search rooms full of filing cabinets, right? So for me, when they computerized maintenance management, and there's thousands of them out there now, and they all have their pros and cons. I would say that there's the basics to all of them is the same. In my experience, I mean, I've seen some of the more fly by night ones and some of the more robust ones. The overall idea behind them is very similar, right? I would think that the biggest issue that we have with the CMMSs, what the companies that call me in, and the CMMSs I've worked in, is that we're not fully utilizing their capabilities. Right? We're still stuck in the old day. I guess that's a terrible word. And I'm gonna tell you the biggest example that I see is when I go into a site, I look at the preventive maintenance that they're putting in the system. And there's a difference between preventive maintenance and proactive maintenance, and that's the reliability and the maintenance differentiation. But most CMMSs, and this isn't my number, it's SMRP, um, said 90% of the OEM PMs are worthless. And that's true in my exact. I got a client right now that has been doing nothing but CMMS. They've loaded their CMMS with their OEM manuals, and they're just terribly unreliable. And it's because the goal of an OEM, having worked for a couple of them in my lifetime, Caterpillar, Komatsu, which is P&H, but now Komatsu, um, isn't to make you reliable. Their goal is to get you to buy more pieces and parts. So they have no reason to give you a maintenance system that's going to make you more reliable. In fact, it's against their business model.
Interesting.
So I tell people, if you're using your OEMs, PMs, you're not doing the right thing on behalf of your machinery, right? And then the other 10% of what goes into those CMMSs is what I call emotional, right? Oh, a pump failed. The senior leadership team, who knows nothing about maintenance, says, I want the pumps changed every year so they never fail again. And that gets put in as a PM. I see it daily when I walk into these plants. So those are the two things you got to get out of your CMMS systems. And then what you want in your CMMS systems is stuff that's focused on your failure modes, right? And it's going to be different in each plant because each machine's just like a child is different. So the CMMSs, I think the biggest disservice we're doing to them is how we're setting them up. I think that if we set them up correctly, we'd see a lot more success out of them. And I know a lot of CMMS or what do you want to call them? The people who
Vendors,
sell
providers.
CMMS, yeah, are going to say, "Oh no, they're great." No, actually, I wouldn't have a job if they were great, and it's not their fault. It's the way we're implementing them, right? Because a lot of these systems are being bought because they're tied to an ERP. So it's bought for a financial reason. They're spec'd out by a financial company, and they're installed by a financial company with maintenance just on the far end. I just had a client that went from Sage to SAP, and because of the character limitations of SAP, they lost all their maintenance data pretty much in that process because it cut it all off.
Yeah.
And that was a killer to them. They actually cost them a year, made me a lot of money, but cost them a year's time for me to get an engineer in there to redo all that information back into their system. And
It's
that's one of
important.
my concerns.
There's so much in there when it comes to changing CMMS platforms. You run a really high risk if you just jump. You have to know, and you also have to make sure you can get good quality data back out of your CMMS. It's yours, you own it. If a company's not going to allow you to extract your data at any given time for any reason you want, I'll say it right now. I don't think it would be a wise idea to work with them. Sorry, had to say it. Um, and the overall impacts here, when we talk about the OEM specs, I've thought, if you at least have something in there, that's good, but it's all going to change by environment. And by the way, when leadership is parachuting in and they're running a business, they kind of know how to run a business really, really well. I maybe shouldn't even say kind of, but they need much more of a go and see approach. They need to spend time with those team members that understand that deeply so that they can at least get some surface level understanding. But if you're going to replace these pumps once per annum, and you think that's going to avert or prevent failures, that's a bunch of hogwash, because this brand new pump that I install, maybe even correctly, on day 3 of operation is going to fail, and you're not going to prevent it. That's hogwash. What do you think? Is that hogwash?
Yeah, it's hogwash. And I tell people that, right? Because I use it as examples. I do assessments on companies, and I always put those in there. I pull them out. I've done thousands of assessments, and I've yet to not find what I just explained to you with the OEM stuff and the emotional stuff. And I'll pull those examples out and I'll put them right into the presentation when I'm giving the presentation to senior leaders. And I'll actually put them on the spot. And I'll say, I talked to your people. I know how this thing got implemented. You guys made a decision at this level. You gave them 30 days to implement it, and then you shut everything off on them. I said, so these problems aren't the shop floor. We don't need to go out and beat up the shop floor, guys. We need to beat up all you in this room. And again, that's being driven because of that 96% of them in that room maybe know how to run a business, but they don't know how to do maintenance, which is a very vital part to that business, right?
Yeah, and they don't have to know everything about it, but they have to participate and try to get some strong enough understanding instead of just throwing around buzzwords where they kind of get it. And it's okay to lean on your experts and say, look, I don't know everything about this, but I have an actual awareness of it. I mean, when we think about all this kind of stuff and we go back to like the OEMs, I'm not throwing them under the bus, but let's say for a moment that I have a formula. I have a formula and I've invented a road tire that will last an incredibly long amount of time. Am I going to be rich because I invented that? The answer is no. I will be wearing a pair of cement shoes. and think about that, folks. I'm not trying to create shock value. I want to switch you over to two things. One, what is your favorite trend of late in the maintenance industry as a whole?
So a lot of people would say that the thing that they love the most is the technology, right? Because it's the bells and the whistles, all the fancy stuff, right? And you may know Doc Johnson. Or Doc Palmer, sorry, the guy that brought the yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So Doc and I love to have these conversations at conferences because I'll tell you that all that fancy technology, even though they call it predictive maintenance, is reactive, right? And what I kind of like to see is us get back to the blocking and tackling of maintenance, and I think there's some of that just because of what I'm being hired to do nowadays is people are trying to get back to the basics and get the basics right before they start spending all the money on the high fancy video gaming technology that's out there. Um, I see a lot more people bringing me in to install lubrication systems, help them with contamination control, teach their technicians how to be journeyman technicians. We don't have those anymore. I mean, we have a very limited body of those because nobody's training them anymore. So I've seen that in the last, I would say, less than a decade of companies starting to look for more of that blocking and tackling. Then, because when I was 20 years ago, there was an explosion of everybody trying to do vibration analysis and all that wonderful stuff, thermography. I went out and got qualified in all of it just because you had to. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with all of it, but if you look at it, and I do this to companies, right? I'll get their last report and I'll tell them, I said, what's this report telling you? And it's telling them that they don't have a good lubrication program. They have a bad contamination control program and they don't install things correctly. It's so they have a fancy tool. It's kind of like if I went to the doc, my doc looks at me every time and says, Nathan, you're overweight. You need to eat right. You need to exercise. He doesn't have to do an EKG to tell him that. He doesn't need to do any of the fancy stuff because he can see it. And I think we can see it, but there's just a whole lot of people out there peddling this fancy stuff that is telling us how bad we're doing our jobs. So I think that there is a trend out there to getting back to blocking and tackling, and I support it because that's my mantra too. Get the three things right. Let's block and tackle before we spend $1 million on a quarterback.
Yeah, and I want to just give a real quick shout out to Rich Wurzbach, Grease Thief, when it comes to the lubrication best practices for sure.
Yeah, I work with Rich and Mike Johnson a lot because
yeah.
They're the guys, right?
It's good stuff, and that's why like people are like, "Oh, Greg, you're you know this and that." I'm like, no, I know this person, I know this person. That's the good stuff. That's the good stuff that makes a difference for everybody. When they listen to the podcast. What are you not liking about the industry? Like, what's being missed?
Well, I think that what's being missed is the leadership side of it, right? If you go out and Google any job description for anything to do with maintenance and reliability, the first line says you need an engineering degree. And that's absolutely the worst thing that you can give, put a guy out of there straight out of college with an engineering degree, because as somebody who has one, they don't teach you anything about leading the maintenance and reliability effort in a plant. They don't teach them much but a whole lot of theory, right? So that first line should be 20 years experience or 10 years, whatever the experience level is, depends on the size of the department and the complexity of the operation, right?
Right.
But that should be what you're looking for, somebody with the experience in whatever it is. And I'm not saying to you if you're going to go to work out in a mine that you have 10 years of mining experience, because I tell this to my clients all the time. A gearbox, a motor, PLCs, none of them know what they're doing. They're just doing, right? They don't care if they're making copper, candy bars, or personal hygiene items. So you don't need somebody that has 10 years of experience in necessarily what you're doing. You need a person with 10 years of experience. I call it journeyman experience at the skilled trade that you're looking for. That's where the electrical and mechanical stuff comes in, right? Not this, well, he's got a college degree and it makes him smart, because I got 3 of them and it doesn't make me smart.
Well, it's all of it. It's all of it, right? Attitude, willingness to learn, willingness to be coached, willingness to stand up when in an appropriate way, like you were giving examples of. Not don't do the Greg way, because that doesn't work. Scorched earth never works, folks. This is all good stuff. One thing that's really important for your first time on CMMS radio is that I ask you 3 fun questions. It's the fun questions segment that
Okay.
everyone must suffer through, and it's also kind of, well, obviously it's fun. So the first one, what is your favorite music?
Oh, I'm an old rock guy, right? The 70s and before type rock world, because that's the world I grew up in, right? So yeah, you can ask my family. In fact, my oldest boy, who's 40, listens to the same kind of music because that's all that was allowed to be played in the house when he was growing up.
Yeah, he put something new on, you'd be like, nah, put that back on my channel. That's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about your favorite sport or hobby? And you don't have to play it. It could be one that you just like to root for and watch.
Yeah. So I mean, of course I'm a played baseball when I was in high school and college. So I'm a big baseball fan. But again, not so much in today's era as it was back in the earlier days. I'm more of a Pete Rose, the Cincinnati, the team of the day. Even though I live in Cincinnati now, I'm an Arizona boy. But at the time, we didn't have the Diamondbacks, so we didn't have a baseball team to root for. It's kind of like we didn't have a football team to root for either back in those days.
Yeah.
You know, the folks over in Dallas told us we had to be Dallas fans, and that rubbed me raw. So I was a Minnesota Viking fan. Uh,
Very interesting. The Vikings are my number 2 team.
oh, really?
Always. Always. I always show them some love. Because my number 1 team, my favorite NFL team, Jerry just messed it up.
Oh,
You see what I did there?
I do.
Uh,
I do.
yeah, so we won't get stuck on that, because nonetheless, there's no wrong answers with any of this stuff anyway. We're having
Yeah.
fun, right? But here's the big one. What is your perspective, philosophy, opinion, anything at all when it comes to this concept of work-life balance?
So I believe that we work to live, not live to work, right? So I was in the younger generation, right? When I got out of the Navy, we worked 26 and 2 at the first mine that I worked at, and I had no life, right? And I'm on my second marriage because of it. Okay, because that was the thing that you did back in those days, right? So I'm transitioning to more of that's another reason I got into this consulting work, right? Is because I make my own schedule. I own this company.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I can work as much or as little as I want. So I have that work-life balance. I get to be at everything now. When I was in the service, I missed holidays and birthdays. You didn't have a choice. When I first got out of the service, I missed the same things because I didn't have a choice. Well, you had a choice, but I didn't realize that I was making the wrong one. So yeah, I believe now. Do I think that everybody should be able to work from home? I mean, if your job requires you to be at work, I think you should be at work, quite frankly, because I know that for me personally, it's hard to work from home. I know I'm not as effective as when I'm sitting in an office nice and quiet and I don't have, the wife coming in and ask me what I want for dinner. She just makes whatever she wants. Yeah. But I
Yeah,
think it's very important that we remember that we're not out here to work. Nobody at the business you're working at's going to remember you when you die, but everybody around your kitchen table will.
that's nice. That's nice. Well, everyone, anyone, connect with Nathan Wright. You can find him on LinkedIn. That's how I got in touch with him. and we started, kind of talking. So reach out to him. He'll definitely jump into a conversation with you, and visit tps-solutions.com or tps-solutions.com, and you can get started on your organizational transformation journey. Nathan, thank you so much for being here with me on CMMS Radio.
Hey, I appreciate you, Greg. Thank you for your time.
You got it. Did you find this episode helpful? Please send us some feedback, suggest a topic, or ask a question. Reach out to CMMS Radio if you need a co-pilot on your CMMS project. Visit cmmsradio.com and use the What's on Your Mind link. Thank you for tuning in to CMMS Radio, your resource for all things CMMS, from selection to implementation, to help you make better choices, learn from industry experts, and have a successful CMMS journey.